Section 2.5, we're going to talk about if-then statements and deductive reasoning. So, what is an if-then statement? It has two parts, a hypothesis and a conclusion. Whatever comes after the if is considered the hypothesis. So, for example, if a basketball player makes a free throw, then he scores 1 point for his team. So the hypothesis is whatever comes after the if. So the hypothesis here is that a basketball player makes a free throw. The conclusion is whatever comes after the then. So he scores 1 point for his team. So we don't include the if or the then in our hypothesis or conclusion. It's just whatever comes after. So if I pass my driving test, then I will get my driver's license. So my hypothesis is after the if. I pass my driving test. The conclusion then is that I will get my license. It will smell bad if you fart. So the hypothesis always comes after the if. So if you fart, so the hypothesis is you fart, and the conclusion is it will smell bad. If I sleep through my alarm, then I will miss the school bus. So after the if is I sleep through my alarm, and then my conclusion comes after the then. So my conclusion is that I will miss the school bus. So every game on my computer is fun to play. Now, there's no if in this sentence. So if there's no if, we're going to keep it in the same order that the sentence reads. So every game on my computer is fun to play. So if there's a game on my computer, then it is fun to play. So if a game is on my computer, then it is fun to play. Now, you're not going to say if every game on my computer, then it is fun to play. You're going to say if a game is on my computer, then it's fun to play, since we know that every game on my computer is fun. I will buy the CD if it costs less than $15. So my hypothesis always comes after the if. So my hypothesis is that it costs less than $15 so it costs less than $15. So if it costs less than $15, then I will buy the CD. So now, since we're starting with saying if it costs less than $15, we have to define what the it means. So in this example, we're talking about the CD. So if the CD costs less than $15, then I will buy it. Okay, we already defined it as the CD, so we can just say it here. We're going to look at two different laws that use our deductive reasoning skills. So deductive reasoning uses facts, definitions, and accepted properties in a logical order to write a logical argument. For example, when you play the game Clue, you use deductive reasoning skills. That's the first place I ever learned the definition of deductive reasoning. So the law of detachment means that if a hypothesis is true, then the conclusion is also true. So for example, if a player goes to practice, then he will play in the game. So this is the hypothesis, this is the conclusion. If I say Joey went to practice, I can conclude that Joey will play in the game. So I told you that the hypothesis was true, so we can conclude that the conclusion is true. If you wash the cotton t-shirt in hot water, then it will shrink. So you wash the cotton t-shirt in hot water. So we're saying the hypothesis is true, which means, using law of detachment, that means my conclusion is true. So it will shrink. The cotton t-shirt will shrink. Sorry, it shrinks because we washed it, so the cotton t-shirt shrinks. If x has a value of 7, then 2x minus 3 has a value of 11. So here is our hypothesis. X has a value of 7, so I'm telling you that the hypothesis is true. Then 2x minus 3 has a value of 11. So if the hypothesis is true, then the conclusion is true. So we know that 2x minus 3 has a value of 11. If two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. Okay, by definition, vertical angles are congruent. So based on this statement, which argument is correct? If two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. So I tell you that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent, so we can conclude that angle 1 and angle 2 are vertical angles. Or angle 1 and angle 2 are vertical angles, so angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. So here I'm telling you that the hypothesis is true, which means that the conclusion is true. So this one doesn't make sense, because if angle 1 and 2 are congruent, well, what if they're both 90 degrees? Right, angle 1 and angle 2. Well, they're congruent, so they're saying that 1 and 2 are vertical angles. These are not vertical angles, though. So just because they're congruent doesn't mean they have to be vertical angles. So we can't switch it around. It just has to be, I'm telling you that this hypothesis is true. Two angles are vertical angles. Two angles are vertical angles. So then the conclusion is true. They are congruent, so we can conclude that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. Law of syllogism. When given two if-then statements, one can conclude with one if-then statement that contains the hypothesis from the first if-then statement and the conclusion from the second if-then statement. So I'll show you what that means. If the rain becomes sleet, then the roads will ice over. If the roads ice over, then the school will be canceled. So we repeated ourselves here when we said, then the roads will ice over if the roads ice over. So we're going to get rid of that middle man, the part that we repeated. And we're going to conclude that if the rain becomes sleet, then school will be canceled. And the reason for that is because the roads will be iced over. But we can rewrite this as an if-then statement. If the rain becomes sleet, then school will be canceled. Don't get tripped up when this says conclusion. Our conclusion for law of syllogism is always going to be an if-then statement. If the daily high temperature is 32 degrees Fahrenheit or less, then the water in the pipe is frozen. If the water in the pipe is frozen, then the pipe will break. So we repeated ourselves here. Then the water in the pipe is frozen if the water in the pipe is frozen. So I'm going to get rid of that middle man that we repeated because it's kind of silly to repeat something. So the conclusion is that if the daily high temperature is 32 degrees Fahrenheit or less, then the pipe will break. So again, our conclusion for a law of syllogism is always going to be an if-then statement. A good way to remember the difference between law of syllogism and law of detachment is that law of syllogism is silly to repeat. It's silly to repeat something, so we get rid of what we repeated and then we rewrite that new if-then statement.